American submarine captains fired everything they had. Perfect approach angles, perfect firing solutions, torpedoes running true and straight toward enemy hulls, and again, nothing happened. No explosion, no secondary detonation. Sometimes just a dull, metallic thud as the torpedo struck the target and failed anyway, followed by the enemy ship sailing on as though nothing had touched it at all. For nearly 2 years into America's war in the Pacific, the United States Navy's primary submarine weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was failing at a rate that should have triggered an emergency investigation within weeks. Instead, the Navy's Ordnance Bureau spent those 2 years insisting the weapon was fine, and the problem was the men firing it. It took inspection work traced back to a specific mechanical component, work performed by ordnance technicians examining the torpedo's internal instruments piece by piece, to finally prove that the entire submarine force had been sent to war with a weapon that had never actually been tested the way it was meant to be used. This is the story of how a catastrophic design flaw in America's most important underwater weapon was identified, not through combat data that submarine crews had been reporting for months, but through methodical instrument-level inspection performed by the women who staffed America's wartime ordnance testing facilities, work that finally forced the Navy to confront a problem it had spent years denying existed. The Mark 14 torpedo entered the war as the primary weapon of the American submarine fleet, developed and refined at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, an institution that had controlled American torpedo design and testing for decades with minimal outside oversight. As American men shipped out to serve in the war overseas, ordnance inspection work at facilities like Newport and its wartime satellite plants increasingly fell to women entering skilled industrial and technical roles for the first time. Women responsible for testing fired torpedoes, examining internal mechanisms component by component, and verifying that instruments matched their manufacturing specifications before weapons were certified for fleet use. This was precise, physically demanding work requiring genuine technical literacy, not routine assembly labor, and it placed these women at the exact point in the weapons pipeline where a systemic design flaw would eventually have to surface if anyone looked closely enough. The weapon incorporated technology that, on paper, represented a significant leap forward from earlier torpedo designs, including a magnetic exploder mechanism intended to detonate the warhead using a ship's own magnetic field, triggering underneath the hull where damage would be most catastrophic rather than requiring a direct contact hit against armored side plating. This magnetic influence technology had been developed and tested under conditions of extreme secrecy before the war, with live-fire testing against actual ship hulls kept to an absolute minimum specifically to avoid revealing the technology to potential adversaries. That secrecy, intended to protect a strategic advantage, meant the weapon entered full-scale combat use, having undergone dramatically less real-world validation than its design complexity actually required. Submarine crews began reporting torpedo failures almost immediately once war patrols commenced in the Pacific in late 1941 and into 1942. Reports described torpedoes that ran beneath their targets without detonating, torpedoes that struck targets directly and simply failed to explode, and in a smaller number of especially alarming cases, torpedoes that appeared to circle back toward the firing submarine itself after a failed run. Individual patrol reports documenting these failures accumulated steadily, submarine commanders describing textbook firing solutions, producing no results against stationary or slow-moving targets that should have represented the easiest possible torpedo attacks available. The Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo design and the primary institutional authority submarine crews, had to convince in order to trigger any design investigation. Response to these reports was consistent and, in retrospect, remarkably resistant to the accumulating pattern of evidence. Failures were attributed to crew error, incorrect firing procedure, or simple bad luck, rather than to any defect in the torpedo's design or manufacturing. This institutional resistance created a specific technical challenge for anyone attempting to actually diagnose the problem. Proving a systemic design flaw required moving past anecdotal combat reports, which the Bureau could dismiss individually, toward physical, instrument-level evidence that identified precisely which mechanical component was failing and why. This required controlled testing under conditions where the actual behavior of a fired torpedo could be measured directly rather than inferred from combat outcomes that had multiple possible explanations. Ordnance inspection teams working at torpedo overhaul and testing facilities, staffed heavily by these newly trained women technicians, began systematically examining the internal depth control mechanism, the component responsible for keeping a torpedo running at its programmed depth beneath the water's surface after launch, a function critical to ensuring the weapon actually passed beneath a target's keel at the depth of the magnetic exploder needed for proper triggering, or struck the hull directly at the depth a contact detonation required. The depth control mechanism relied on a hydrostatic pressure sensor calibrated to detect water pressure at specific depths and adjust the torpedo's diving planes accordingly, maintaining a consistent running depth throughout its approach to a target. Inspectors examining torpedoes pulled from testing runs began identifying a consistent discrepancy between the depth a torpedo was set to run at before firing and the depth it was actually observed running at once launched, a gap that testing under controlled conditions, firing torpedoes into fishing nets specifically rigged to physically capture the weapon's actual depth track, eventually quantified with precision the Bureau's earlier theoretical calculations had never approached. The torpedoes were running significantly deeper than their depth control settings indicated they should, meaning weapons fired at a depth calculated to pass directly beneath a target's hull were instead passing several additional feet below it, out of effective range for the magnetic exploder's detonation trigger entirely. Tracing this discrepancy back to its actual mechanical cause required these women inspectors to examine the calibration of the hydrostatic pressure sensor itself against known pressure standards, rather than simply trusting the specification the instrument had been manufactured to. What inspection revealed was that the sensor's calibration, verified during pre-war testing under conditions that had never involved firing a live torpedo carrying its actual combat warhead, failed to account for the additional weight and pressure dynamics introduced once torpedoes were loaded with a full explosive charge, rather than the lighter dummy warheads used during peacetime test runs. A torpedo tested extensively before the war, with a lightweight practice warhead, behaved measurably differently once loaded with the substantially heavier live warhead it would actually carry into combat. And that difference was sufficient to throw off the depth control mechanism's calibration in a way nobody had identified because nobody had rigorously tested live warhead torpedoes against physical depth measurement equipment before submarines were sent into combat carrying them. This single identified discrepancy, verified through repeated net testing that physically captured torpedo depth tracks rather than relying on any theoretical recalculation, provided exactly the kind of concrete, reproducible evidence the Bureau of Ordnance could no longer dismiss as anecdotal reporting from individual commanders who might have made a firing error. The testing demonstrated the same depth deviation consistently across multiple test firings under controlled conditions that eliminated crew procedure as a possible explanation entirely. Faced with physical evidence rather than combat anecdotes, the Bureau was finally forced to authorize a formal recalibration of the depth control mechanism across the torpedo fleet, adjusting the hydrostatic sensor's calibration to account for the actual pressure dynamics of a fully armed, combat-ready torpedo rather than the lighter test configuration that had defined its original specification. The depth control flaw was, as it eventually turned out, only the first of several compounding defects that had been degrading Mark 14 performance simultaneously. A magnetic exploder that proved unreliable across a range of magnetic field conditions the Navy had not adequately anticipated, and a contact exploder firing pin mechanism that, in a bitter irony, inspectors identified through subsequent testing, was prone to bending and failing specifically during the kind of perfect perpendicular hits against a target's hull that represented the ideal firing scenario every submarine crew was trained to achieve. Each of these defects required its own dedicated inspection and testing process to isolate and correct. But the depth control discovery represented the critical first breakthrough, the piece of concrete physical evidence that broke through nearly 2 years of institutional denial and forced systematic investigation of a weapon system that had been failing in combat since the earliest weeks of the war. The human cost of this 2-year delay is difficult to calculate with precision, but impossible to overstate in significance. Submarine crews spent the first half of the Pacific War firing weapons that frequently failed to perform as designed, undermining the effectiveness of an entire branch of the American war effort at a moment when submarine warfare represented one of the few offensive tools immediately available against Japanese shipping. Commanders who reported failures accurately were, in a number of documented cases, treated with skepticism that damaged their professional standing, their combat reports effectively dismissed by an ordnance bureaucracy more invested in defending its pre-war design and testing process than in confronting evidence that the process itself had produced a fundamentally under-tested weapon. Once the depth control fix, alongside subsequent corrections to the magnetic and contact exploder mechanisms, was implemented across the fleet, American submarine torpedo effectiveness improved dramatically, transforming the submarine force from a chronically underperforming weapons platform into one of the most effective offensive tools of the entire Pacific campaign. The technical work required to reach that transformation depended entirely on inspectors willing to test a weapon's actual mechanical behavior against physical, reproducible evidence rather than accepting either the manufacturer's original specification or the institutional assumption that experienced crews, rather than defective equipment, were the source of repeated combat failure. What makes this story resist simple summary is the specific nature of the institutional failure it exposed. This was not a case of a flaw being impossible to detect. Submarine crews had been reporting the pattern accurately for nearly 2 years before physical inspection evidence finally forced acknowledgement of what those reports had been describing all along. The barrier to fixing the problem was not technical difficulty. It was an institution structurally reluctant to question its own pre-war testing process, a reluctance that persisted until inspectors produced evidence specific and reproducible enough that dismissing it as anecdote or error was no longer a credible institutional response. Every dusty page still hides a name history forgot to remember. Follow Iron Women Archives, and let's keep prying those pages open, one forgotten woman at a time.